Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight for EMP Skillshare, steps you can take to level up networking and demystifying the publishing process. My name is Laura Santoyo, and I am the Secretary for National EMP Network. I also serve on the Advocacy Committee. I wanted to take this opportunity to share that we are transitioning to a new membership platform. If you haven't already joined us there, it's called the Mighty Network. We invite you to join us if you haven't already. This is a new platform that has a discussion board, internship and job postings, a review of museum studies programs, and a ton of other resources, and they're all for free. And also joining the Mighty Network will let you join regional chapters, and those chapters will help you connect to other EMPs locally, which is really great. I'll drop that link to the Mighty Network in the chat just in case you need it. I also wanted to put a plug in for our swag that is now available. If you haven't yet purchased some merchandise, you can on Bonfire. There's t-shirts, mugs, tote bags, you name it. I think there's some face masks too. The purchases support our mission to help EMPs like you, including funding speakers for events like this. So I'll drop the link to our fundraiser in the chat as well. Some basic housekeeping rules. I'm sure many of you have attended lots of these Zoom presentations, so I probably don't even need to go over these, but just in case. This presentation is being recorded for future use. If you don't want to be visible, feel free to turn your camera off. We will not be offended. The recording will be uploaded to our YouTube channel probably sometime next week. Please keep yourself on mute during the presentation. That's just so that our panelists aren't distracted by background noise or anything like that. If you do have questions for our panelists, that's fantastic. We just ask that you drop your questions into the chat. And there'll be a Q&A portion at the end. So before we get started, I just want to introduce our lovely panelists. Tory Cox is the Virginia G. Schroeder Curator of Arts at the Evansville Museum of Arts, History, and Science. Completing her master's in museum studies at Johns Hopkins in 2022, Cox has published original research in journals such as Collections, a journal for museum and archives professionals, the Informal Learning Review, and the Illinois Women Artists Project. Currently, she is a reviewer for Curator, the Museum Journal. Julie Decker is an associate professor of history at Rochester Institute of Technology, where she directs the Museum Studies and Public History program. She earned her PhD from the Joint Program in Art History and Museum Studies at Case Western Reserve University, Cleveland Museum of Art. She serves as editor of the peer-reviewed journal Collections. Michelle Reynolds, she is another board member. She's the director of resources, where she works closely with our publishing partner, the Museum Scholar, to produce the Theory and Practice Journal. Outside of NEMPN, she is a devoted arts and culture professional with over 10 years of experience working in and around museums and education, curation, and outreach. She is currently flexing her storytelling and engagement skills as the Associate Director of Marketing and Communications at the Tacoma Art Museum in Washington. So welcome, panelists. So to begin with, Tory, I'm gonna put you on the spot. You've said that Julie was the one who encouraged you to publish. Can you talk a little bit about what your first publishing experience was like? You know, how did you overcome maybe your anxiety and find your voice?
Sure, absolutely. And thank you so much for the opportunity to speak tonight. And just for our audience, for you to know, we're going to do things a little informal because who is not Zoom fatigued at this point? So publishing, scary. Really, with COVID, it did come an opportunity to reinvent oneself. And why I say that is, this is the first time, at least in my professional experience, that I saw people across the country, different disciplines, all come together for a common goal, and that was to do rapid response collecting. And it was so fast, everything was happening so quickly, our life was changing at astronomical rates that you just could never anticipate happening. And even getting started with the collecting process of documenting human experience during COVID-19 was quite challenging and quite terrifying too. But I figured that if I just trust in the research, trust in the skill sets, and trust in what I learned at Johns Hopkins. So for example, in the collection management course, we did have a little section about the importance of documenting human experience from museum interpretation and how that turns into a positive resource for communities. And as a community curator, and that's while my title is curator of art, my entire existence at Evansville is to make sure that the community is connected into everything that we do because we serve them. And it was blind faith at that point, and collecting stories. Started small and then started to grow to over 100 stories, and then it started to grow to cross-country and international, and that's when I started to interact with Julie. She was part of the Journal of the Plague Year repository project, and from the experiences that we're having at Evansville, she made the mention of wanting us to publish for Sage to do a specific piece, excuse me, allergies, or do a focus piece on collecting. And honestly, it was terrifying, absolutely terrifying. I don't know if that ever came through, Julie, how scared I really was to really do this and to participate, because I wouldn't say that I have identity issues or imposter syndrome, but I try not to show it professionally, but I do have a very small self-esteem at times and confidence level. However, I know what's expected of me in this field. I know that you have to network. I know that you have to be the brand manager, depending on what resources you read about your museums and about your exhibitions, and you have to have that face if you're the curator. And so I never wanted to show that anxiety or that fear, but it was always there. So I made sure to overcome that by doing, because I do tell my interns through my program that even when you are scared and you have a lack of confidence, you can't use that as a hindering point to move forward in this field. It's over competitive, it's oversaturated. You have to set yourself apart. You have to know how to network. And so it was me getting a taste of my own medicine from the advice that I was giving to my interns. And so it was easier to hide behind a screen, I will say that. Excuse me. We had Zoom calls, we had emails, and that did make things a little bit easier. I'm not gonna lie, it probably would have been scarier to have done this face to face, but I still would have done it because it would have been a huge opportunity not to. And some of this residual fear comes from a little bit of my background, because I come from a lower middle class family. No one even understands in my family what I do. They're happy and they're supportive, they don't understand. My dad's a factory worker, mom's stay-at-home mom, but extremely supportive. I'm very grateful for that, but that fear has always been there. So when the opportunity came to publish, I didn't think that I was good enough to do so. I didn't think that I had a perspective. I didn't think I was smart enough. It didn't matter that I've been in the museum field at that point 10 years. Didn't matter that, you know, I'm in a prestigious school at Johns Hopkins, very grateful. Didn't matter that I graduated top of my class at IUPUI. That fear was there. And so when Julie proposed this, honestly, I had a little bit of a breakdown. I was like, oh my God, how am I going to do this? But honestly, it was sitting down. I literally had this little pop-up lawn chair. I swear my boss just looks at me like I'm weird at times. And I put this little lawn chair in the Gothic room. And the Gothic room is a gallery at the Evansville Museum that's extremely special to me. It's where our 18th century on down artwork is housed. I feel comfortable there. My undergraduate was focused on medieval art. So when I'm around that type of art, I do feel a lot better. It's quite therapeutic. So I literally popped up the lawn chair, I sat down, and I just did a brain dump. And there was over 2,000 words on that brain dump. And I sent it to Julie. I'm like, hey, this is my first draft. It's very emotionally charged. I hope I'm not all over the place, but this is kind of where I'm at. And again, I don't know if Julie picked up on that fear that was there, but really I just needed a little bit of validation because I was scared. And when she sent back, this is great, this is good, you know, we can, this will work. That's when it finally clicked. I'm like, well, I think this is actually horrible, but she says it's good. So what's stopping me from making it better to what I think is good? And so that's really what helped me kind of move it forward and write something that was much longer and to get this publication. And while I was working with Julie, If anybody would listen to me about the COVID project that we were doing at the Evansville Museum, I would cold call, email, and again, it's easier to hide behind a screen, but it did help, and that fear was still there, and that's why I got introduced the Informal Learning Review. I cold emailed the editor because I saw one of her presentations through AAM, and told her what I was doing, and I did a different version of the article I sent to Julie, a smaller version, and it got that published, the Informal Learning Review. And that really helped right there because I did have that little validation that I was smart enough, I did have something to say, and then I was able to expand that and make it unique because Julie's article was definitely different than the ones from the Informal Learning Review. And from there, it's really helped a lot. I didn't have this fear, and that's where the Illinois Women's Artist Project came in. I got a cold message from the director who wanted me to write a piece for Edith Searchy, so I wrote that article. And so far, it's been extremely helpful because the second you get the first one there, it is that validation that you need. But really, if it wasn't for Julie reaching out, saying that she wanted my perspective, and also saying that you do have something to say, I don't know where I would be. I would hope that at some point I would have taken the plunge because I am a curator. It is an expectation. It is in my job description, but it is scary, especially when you don't have a master's. And I can play the I don't game all day. I don't have no experience. I don't have a master's. I don't have a PhD. Why do you care what I have to say? But at the end of the day, I was my own worst enemy. And getting through that first hurdle opened up the door to a whole new opportunity.
Thanks, Tory. I think, oh, thanks, Julie. Julie just dropped the article that Tory published into the chat, as well as a couple other resources. So make sure you check those out. But Tory, and we'll get to it a little bit later, so I don't want to jump too much into it now, but I think what you just hit on, you know, like we're our own worst enemies. I think that was perfect. I think we definitely are, right? We kind of have that voice in the back of our head that's telling us, you know, I don't have a new perspective. I'm not important. Like, who cares what I think? And, you know, I think having people like Julie, right, who support us and who believe in us, I think that definitely helps. That definitely helps. Julie, did you want to say anything about that since you worked with Tory?
Sure. I think, well, Tory, first of all, you are smart enough, and I'm so glad that you kind of explained that part of your journey. And I put the link in there to Tory's article, and that's from a whole series of articles that came out about collections and COVID, and they're all published through the journal collections, but they're all open access because they're considered COVID content. And I think everyone's perspectives for those articles is so vastly different because Tory was working at a museum and sort of how she was actually collecting materials during COVID, and some of the stories are about digitization, and there's just a lot of different perspectives. But I think they're just in general speaking in terms of publishing during COVID, there's been kind of an ebb and a flow. There was an abundance of just nothing in publishing right when COVID hit. You know, it was a pandemic, and so people were not publishing. And then, and I'm making a generalization here, but and then there was this bumper crop of publications, much like the one that Tory produced and others that were talking about then, okay, so we were still working, how are we telling our stories? And that has really meant that within a year of the pandemic, we're able to see how people in collections and in the museum space actually responded, which I'm really grateful for. And now there's kind of on the back end, there's just this glut now in publishing of so many pieces coming out and books, and just peer review is way behind. And so it was an interesting, just kind of thinking through the past year in that space, just how there really was this stop and then a big uptick, and now we're kind of in this space of waiting right now for other things to come out. And so Tory's piece and the others are a large part of that, and I'm really grateful that we could share those. So yeah.
Well, Julie, that kind of leads into the question I have for you. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your experiences as an editor for collections? How did you get into this kind of work? You know, how do you become an editor of publication? And is this the first publication you've worked on? You know, I just want to hear a little bit about your journey.
So thank you, Laura. So So I've been editing the journal collections since 2008. And I guest edited 2 issues in 2008, focused on public art, and actually public sculpture, outdoor public sculpture specifically, because that's the field that I work in. I research monuments and memorials, and I manage the public sculpture collection for the city of Cleveland for a number of years. So I was tapped to guest edit 2 issues, which means like there's an actual editor, Pam White. She's fantastic. She's now at Western Illinois, although she just told me she's retiring soon. Darn. So she was the editor. So she asked me to guest edit, which means you're kind of bringing in an idea and you're going to curate all of the articles that come with it. So I did that for 2 issues, and then was asked to stay on the journal. And so I've been doing that journal. I've been editing that journal and steering the ship for a really, really long time. And every time I think about that, it's like 13 years, which is pretty incredible. But I have an editorial board that I work with. There's about 30 editorial board members, and we kind of rotate 3-year terms. And then after a few years, I ask folks to step off for a rotation or something. And so this is the first journal that I've edited on my own. And what that means is I'm working with the editorial board to steer the ship, but to chart the course in terms of we have the fixed scope and content, which is collections across the museum space, and libraries and archives and special collections. It's pretty vast. And so we try to figure out what might be interesting articles. We have open issues that are just all sorts of articles about all sorts of topics, broadly defined. But then we also have focus issues, which is like the one that Tory submitted to, where there's content that is curated around a special theme, like the one that I started on back in 2008. So I've been doing that since 2008, and I have really enjoyed that journey. I've been with the journal collections, which is not part of an affiliated society and not part of a focus group of any kind. It's just a journal that is published by Sage. So what that means is we don't have a strong affinity group to any one entity. And what that means also is I have been with the journal since when it was with Altamira Press. Then it was sold to the parent company of Rowman and Littlefield, and then it was sold to Sage. So I have just kind of followed it along the journey to all the various places, and it's been a great journey. I've also founded a journal called Frameless Journal, which is a peer-reviewed journal that deals with augmented reality and virtual reality, because that's a space that I work in with my teaching at Rochester Institute of Technology. And so we founded that in 2019. It's open access, it's peer-reviewed, like the Sage Journal. It is international, but it's much smaller. It's just starting out, and it's hosted by my university. And so, but the journey, just to sort of step in there with the personal side of this, the journey for me for publishing was pretty horrific early on, and I never felt that I had anything to say in the very beginning, because my trajectory from my master's degree to my PhD was full of lots of bumps, and I hadn't actually completed my master's degree. After completing my coursework, it took me about 5 years to finish my master's thesis. There was a lot of personal upset and some academic reasons that prevented me from doing it. But that time away from it gave me the sort of ability to step back and think, okay, what am I doing here? Like, what is my purpose? Like, why do I want to finish this? You know, every obstacle seems to be put before me to not finish it. So why do I want to finish it? Like, why bother? And that 5 years of journey and trying to figure out and doing all sorts of jobs here and there, and then realizing I actually wanted to finish my master's and go for my PhD, then helped me to realize that I wanted my degree, but I also wanted to do the work in the field, both in the space of the museum and in academia. So when I went finally to Case Western for a PhD, and the program is with the Cleveland Museum of Art, so I had a foot in both worlds, and I loved it. My advisor there was a mentor who constantly said that he wasn't like stroking my ego all the time, but he constantly found value in something that I had written. And he and I are still friends to this day. He's moved on. He lives in Europe. He's European and he lives in Europe. So he moved back. And that validation by someone else, at least just seeing something, gave me the courage then to think, oh, if he thinks it's pretty good, and he's got a PhD, then maybe there's something there. And so I published my first piece in an Indiana University journal called Oculus, and it was on something related to my dissertation. And when I published that, it was a dream come true, and I was so happy. And like Tory, you sent it to my mom, and she's like, "Okay, are you done with your degree now?" She was trying to figure out like what that meant, but to me, it meant the world, and that was just the beginning. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, I think, it's interesting and very telling that the both of you had a similar experience in that you both kind of doubted yourselves and you needed that kind of confidence booster, that support system. And so I hope that really resonates with everyone in the audience here. If you're feeling the same way, you're not alone. And the people here that are talking have published despite that lack of confidence and because of the support that they had. So I think that's nice that the both of you have said that, right? That's a common shared experience. So you're not alone if you're experiencing the same kind of things. So then that leads us to Michelle. Can you tell us more about the journal that you work on with Museum Scholar for anybody who's not familiar with it, Theory and Practice? And then also I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about how your experience as an Associate Director of Marketing Communications, like how your skill set there kind of ties into writing and journal work and all of that.
Absolutely. So I'll start with Theory and Practice. So we are in the last stretches of finishing up volume 4 of Theory and Practice, which is it is like the National Emerging Museum Professionals Network journal. It's open access, it's peer reviewed. We do, as Laura mentioned, co-produce it with the Museum Scholar. It's free to submit and it's free to access. So it's really a low barrier to entry experience for all people who sort of fit into that EMP mold or mindset. So we ask and invite submissions from everyone who considers themselves an emerging professional across the community, including people who work at all institutions that utilize a collection to educate the public. So really the widest swath of museums that you can possibly think of. And folks are encouraged to submit any type of work. I know we kind of talked in sort of preparation for this conversation about all the different kinds of things that you can publish. And I know we'll touch on that in a little bit, but we keep that in mind too for Theory and Practice. And so it's case studies, it's research papers, presentations, reviews of exhibitions or books. Anything is in that realm is really welcome as long as it sort of explores something related to museums and in some ways maybe fits the theme that we have overall for each edition. So all past issues or volumes, I should say, are available online. They're easy to peruse. We're still sort of figuring out all of the kinks and working through it, but we're excited to wrap up volume 4 and then sort of look ahead to the fall where we'll start again on volume 5. So there'll be some more information that we'll share out later as that sort of process gets together, but it's a really accessible way, I think, of getting into publishing. And my first interaction with NEMPN was around Theory and Practice. I started as a peer reviewer, which actually ties in really nicely to what I do professionally. I have not published formally, but all of my experience is in the background. So I have helped edit volumes. I have helped edit journals or museum catalogs. I have spent many an hour hunting and pecking for various grammar issues and fixing all of the commas and asking people to clarify things. I am the sort of nagging voice in all of my colleagues' Google Docs around, can you expand on this? And part of that comes from my background. I have a master's degree in art history and a master's degree in museum studies. And so it's that sort of art history training that really sort of drills in all of those like fine formal quality practices of writing. And I use it every day. So to Laura's question about how marketing, it is kind of strange, but it's a part of my everyday. I review all kinds of stuff from everybody who's writing other things. And we also sort of spearhead a lot of content creation in my museum. So we handle blogs and kind of manage voice in that space as well. So it does fit in really nicely with all that behind the scenes stuff. And it has helped me figure out better ways of encouraging colleagues to explore ideas. And I like to think that it's the way I've found to contribute to a publishing process that is, my name's not on the piece, but it's somewhere in an acknowledgement. And that works just as well for me in the way that I kind of approach and think about it as a sort of collaboration. But yeah, so I started with Theory and Practice as a reviewer, and we've sort of been expanding the ways. That's another potential way that we're sort of figuring out ways to get folks into or better understanding the publishing process, is seeing how they can serve in those different capacities. So we're hopeful to share more information soon, probably later this summer, early fall, around how folks can see, like, if maybe publishing right now is not like, you're not exactly sure, you're not there yet, maybe being a peer reviewer, serving in that initial capacity might push you over the edge, be like, oh, I can do this. Like, this is something that I can absolutely be a part of and be really confident about my own thoughts and arguments and ideas.
Can I just add one thing there? Laura, can I add to what Michelle just said? The one point that, well, two things actually, Michelle, when you said you're in the acknowledgements, and that is like gold. It's like seriously, like the fact that you acknowledge that being in the acknowledgements is so important. Yes, your name may not be on the piece, but your blood is like the ether that's running through all of it. I mean, so it may not be visible, but it's definitely there. So yes, I totally agree with what you just said. But the point that you just made about the peer review part is so important, because many times people say, well, I haven't written something, so I can't peer review. That is not true. That is completely not true. In fact, sometimes being a peer reviewer for the first time doing it actually is a good way to fully understand the publishing process, because then you actually see through the lens of kind of, it's not your work, so you're looking at someone else's and you're kind of seeing it through all of the steps. And so if people on this Zoom or otherwise later listening to this or watching it, yes, peer review, you do not have to be published to have done it. You need to be someone who can look at something, read it, interpret it, find parts that may be not so clear or that may need some help or some correction or some kind of clarification, or it may be a processual article where you're talking about the process of something and the person writing it leaves out the big step that's so obvious to them but not to us. So being a peer reviewer is so critically important, and it's a great way to get started in publishing if you're not sure that you're ready to actually write an article. So I'm so glad you said that, Laura, or Michelle. Thank you for saying that.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that too, because I know I felt the same way when I became a grant reviewer. I was like, I've never really, like, I've written a couple grants, but it's so true, you know, like it gives you insight into the process and helps you eventually when you go to write that grant or you go to write that article, it really helps you write a better grant or article than you probably would have written in the first place, right? Because you just have that insight. So yeah, thanks, Michelle. So then this is open to any panelist that wants to answer. Hopefully it'll be, you know, a little bit of a popcorn thing. What advice would you give to somebody who has an article that they want to publish, but they just aren't sure where to start? You know, I know we literally just talked about like become a editor, right? Or become a peer reviewer. Maybe that's one way, but what are some other ways? What does the process look like?
So I can start with just a quick thing and then pass it off to whomever. So one thing I would say, just if you have an article and you're just kind of like, or it's a paper from a program and you're kind of like playing around with it a little bit further, is just to keep the file somewhere where it's accessible to you on your laptop or your Google Docs or whatever, and come back to it. So there's two pieces of information. Come back to it every now and then, whether that's every couple of weeks or once a month, and just take a peek at it. Don't pressure yourself unless you're someone who loves deadlines. Don't pressure yourself like, I want to submit this by January 1st. Just keep coming back to it. Make it present, make it visible in your workspace, wherever that is. So it's not ever too far. And then the second thing I would say is to start reading from various publications. And I'll put a link in the chat in a little bit with a link to some. Start reading various publications to see where your work might fit. It may not fit today with the article that you have written right now, but it may fit eventually if you can kind of create it into the space that journal sits. So keep it present and then keep reading so you can kind of figure out, where is my voice and where can I try to contribute most effectively with this story?
I would second that idea of reading and of using that as a tool to fine tune how you present your ideas. It's both super helpful when you're thinking about just writing and like figuring out what your writing voice is too, because you can read other people and be inspired, or find things that you truly don't like and use something to work in opposition to that. And all of it will just help you figure out, as you're kind of, to Julie's point, like parsing through those ideas and working through where you want to pitch something or how it might work in a certain journal. Just being open to the idea of those styles and methods changing a little bit. I know, at least for me, from an art history background, we're taught how to do art history, and we're taught how to do it in what I think by most people's standards can be super dry, but that's the way we have to do it. And so you learn that, but you can also find places and ways to kind of spice it up a bit or change it or put your own spin on it. And I think it can only benefit you to read more and be engaged in all of that literature that's going around. Even if you never happen to find a way to submit to a journal, it's just great to be informed in that way.
And so for a little bit of participation from our audience, physically speaking, there are a few master students here. So there's a little reaction button. Can you put a thumbs up if you're in a master's program, or a thumbs down if you're in a master's program? Give you a sec. So there's one. Oh, there's a hand clap. I like it. So just in case if you don't know the reactions, that's okay. Oh, there's another one. Cool. You're in a master's program. You read. You already know what's expected of you for a publication, because every single program requires you to read. And it took me a second to figure that out, and it didn't click until I became a reviewer. You know what you need to do. You read articles all day, you pay to read articles, and you have that wonderful thing called JSTOR, EMU, and all. Yeah, you got Hopkins, there's another one. Especially if you're in the Hopkins program. The resources are already there. You just have to find the confidence and the voice, and that's hard. I've been there. And please, I'll definitely send my email address so we can talk to one another, but you already know what to do, and that's half the battle. It's taking the skill sets that you already have, and it's applying them to a practical experience like publishing. And once you figure that out, it's pretty amazing, like how easy it is to make that transaction from having the confidence, not having the confidence to getting it, and to realize it's no different than what you're reading in your lessons, especially in Hopkins, and also the Blackboard assignments, like Shirley was saying, so was Michelle. Keep that document open, think about it, retweak your assignments. You have the theory, you have the practice, you have the collections, and you have the internship experience realistically. And if not, you still have something to offer because you have a unique perspective that we want to read. So that's just my advice, is you already have the tools, you already have the skill sets. Now, do you have the confidence to do it? And I think so.
So then I might be jumping ahead of myself here a little bit, but Michelle, I know you said that Theory and Practice is a great journal for beginners, right? Like maybe people who haven't published before, or for emerging museum professionals, but kind of going along with, where do we start if we want to publish? Like if I had an article and I was like, yeah, this is ready to go, like, where do I look? Like, what journal should I be looking at? Is it depending on the style or format of my article? Is it depending on the topic of my article? I had a friend ask me that recently and I was like, that's a great question. I don't know where you start with that. Like, where do you look for journals that you can publish in?
So I'm going to put a little link. The first link in the chat is just to, I think it went through, yeah, to a Google Doc that I have off of a little link tree that I made that has some resources. And so the link tree, the bottom link is the one that has just like a panel of resources. And then the first one's Google Doc. And I think, yeah, like trying to figure out the space. So there are quite a few different journals and each one has its own, they call it scope and content. So the scope is kind of the range, the sort of framing of it, and the content is kind of then each issue, sort of whether it's an open issue or a focus issue. And each one has its own sort of niche, if you will, or niche, if you will. And this isn't a complete list. This is just a bunch of them, but it's in no ways conclusive. And I think trying to, it's like a pair of shoes, trying to find the right fit. So to go back to Tory's point, if you have this sort of internship that you did and you're kind of thinking like, well, could I write about this as a process piece about like what I did? I digitized this collection and, you know, the museum or institution has given me permission to write about it. Like where do I go with this? Well, the journal that I edit, Collections, is about collections. So it could certainly fit there. It would have to have a certain angle to focus on collections. But let's say you ended up doing something with it that was about a curatorial practice. So you digitize and it was used for a curatorial practice or a project or something of that sort. Maybe Curator is a better fit. So trying to figure out within each journal then kind of what is their specific lens or angle. And it doesn't mean that you have to write everything so it fits that perfectly and you're going to have to change all your ideas. Write your piece, write your ideas down, get your draft going, have that Google Doc, and then try to figure out, okay, what might I do to tweak it, what I've already written to kind of fit in a certain space, because the journals are bound by kind of their purview of what they're interested in. And sometimes it's really narrow, and sometimes it's really, really wide and vast. And just being sure that you're submitting a piece to the appropriate journal so that you are presenting yourself to a platform that would genuinely be interested. And when folks send us something that is not with our fit, I just let them know almost immediately upon receipt, this is outside of our scope, and I always recommend, like, here's one or two places you might look at, because sometimes people don't know that there's these other publications. And if you Google museum publications, you just get a whole array of things, right? So it just to kind of it's like a pair of shoes, try and find a good fit for your work.
And then that reminds me, Michelle, I know you said Theory and Practice is wrapping up its fourth run, but do you mind dropping the link to that in the chat just for folks to check out if they haven't looked at it yet? Just so that in the fall, when it is back up and running and accepting admissions, maybe people can check it out.
Absolutely. Coming right up.
Thank you. I meant to ask earlier and I got off track. But yeah, Julie, that's a good point, because I think I've done that too. You know, when you Google museum publications, it's like 100 pages on, you don't know, you know, you can't narrow it down. Yeah. So that's hard. And then I imagine too, you would recommend, you know, how do you know if it's a good fit besides on its website where it says what its scope is, like maybe reading articles that have been submitted and accepted to those journals would also help people.
And also like looking at the table of contents for the past few issues and kind of seeing, for our journal, we have on the main page of Sage for our journal, we have what's called a gallery with little slides. So those little pictures that have information. And each one of those gallery images will say something, I think, about the editorial board, and then it'll say something about a special call we're doing. So a special call like the one that Tory submitted to has this really specific focus. And so that might be something that you're like, oh, wow, that's exactly what I'm working on. And that would make it an even more perfect fit, because it's like, oh, I could be in the community of scholars that are writing about that. And so, yeah, I think checking the table of contents and just kind of, and reading through and seeing articles that you're like, oh, this is kind of cool, or, oh, this takes place at this type of at an archive, but I'm doing this in the museum space, and how, you know, how your work kind of gels with that in some way. Definitely, I think, and even if you don't see something that looks like an ideal fit, definitely feel free to reach out to the journal editors or anyone on the editorial board to ask questions. I mean, that's what they're there for. They're resources. And that's the way I feel about our journal and our journal editorial board, the same. They're happy to answer questions. And if they don't know the answer, then they'll just point folks to me. So, and we'll figure it out together. So yeah, definitely.
Great, thank you. So then, what are some resources out there you might recommend that would help somebody write a good article or improve their article or a piece for publication?
And so definitely the caveat what's been said is about the read. It's one of the most important things, but really to focus on volunteering to be a reviewer. I went to a CuraCom AAM publishing panel, and that's when I met the editor for also Curator, and then Julie was on there too. And it was as simple as just asking, hey, do you have a spot for me? I would love to be a reviewer. Here's my CV, and here's why I'm interested. Just asking, just like Julie said, they're there to help you, and they're there to encourage you too, because they need content producers, and that future person who wants to review could potentially be a content reviewer. But it is a good way to get in the door. That's a wonderful resource, because you will be able to see what gets published, what doesn't, because you do get the results afterwards, and that will help you to navigate what really is articles and what is a format example, like what actually gets into the final stage of reviewing. And when you're the one who's conducting that analysis, again, it's scary, because the first article I had a panic attack on, because it's just, I don't know, but it does get easier. But again, being able to lean on that master's experience of reading articles all the time, it didn't fit what I read in class, didn't fit what I was reading in school, because those are peer-reviewed academic published journals. So that was really helpful right there. That was the most realistic experience I could have asked for, and that was the most eye-opening one too. So for the resources, I would extremely recommend becoming a reviewer. It doesn't take that much time. You get to create an account through the journal who you review for. What's great is that account is similar to the type of account you're going to make when you do the actual publishing process. You make an account, you upload all your stuff, you get the comments from the reviewers. And so if you're publishing, you see that end, but when you're a reviewer, you see the back end of what that looks like too, and that makes it more holistic. So that would be one of the biggest things I would recommend. But also, if you are a member of AAM or one of your national networks like MAAM or the Midwestern Museum Association, MMA, there are a ton of discussion boards, and there are a lot of journal editors who hang out on those discussion boards. And I've had a lot of conversations, even with John Fraser, not only about Curator, but also about other articles, and they see them pop up quite a bit. And so your editors are looking at those discussion boards too, and are quite active. So that's a wonderful resource to go to, and they will help you, just like Julie said, they're there for you. And it will really help to answer any questions that you have.
I would say too, just to piggyback on that, Tory, that the spaces, especially if you're thinking of, more, I don't know what the word is I'm trying to think of, but in terms of like message boards and communities, keeping an eye on spaces like NEMPN, where, we're still figuring out what it looks like this fall, but, coming together to answer questions, have conversations, and then also potentially do sort of workshops and things like these kinds of conversations where you have the opportunity to ask and engage, and really recognizing that no question is a bad question ever. So really feeling comfortable to get into those spaces and ask people what their thoughts are, And in some cases, you know, that could lead to like a writing buddy or somebody who helps keep you accountable or helps review your work or vice versa. So that notion of going into the community and really sort of seeking what you're looking for. I mean, I know it's kind of daunting sometimes and it's hard to be like, am I the only person who doesn't know how to do this thing? But just kind of throwing it out there or following along with some of the conversations in those spaces can be super, super helpful, more helpful than, you know, just a Google search.
Yep, and I would add definitely the being a reviewer and definitely reaching out to the board members. And Michelle, when you said accountability, it reminded me, I mean, so you all may be familiar with the work of Gretchen Rubin, and she does this thing, it's called the Four Tendencies. It's kind of like your type or your style. Bottom line is, are you someone who likes to have outer accountability? Like, does a deadline actually help you? Or are you like a deadline, like it doesn't make any difference whether I do it that day or not? So I think knowing a little bit about yourself and what structures you work with and what work with you. And so I'll put her link in the chat in a second, but so figuring out what works for you. If you have a deadline, if writing an article is a goal for yourself, you're not being forced to do it. It's just something because you feel like you want to get to the next level of whatever it is. You want to level up, right? So that's the name of our talk tonight. So what's going to get you to level up? So what structure? So for me, I have inner accountability. I can make deadlines and I can meet them. If someone else is telling me to meet it, it's like, well, I'll meet it, but I have inner accountability. So for me, it's like a goal for myself. So I know that, so therefore I can structure so that the deadlines that I set are deadlines for myself. And so figuring out a little bit about how you work and what's going to work for you to reach this particular goal, I think is like step one. So it's not really a specific resource. I'll put Gretchen Rubin stuff in there about Four Tendencies, but figuring that part out first, I think is really helpful. And then kind of moving from there and thinking through all the things that were just mentioned, the accountability piece, I think is really helpful for lots of people, whether you're an internal sort of accountability person or not, but having a buddy or a partner that you kind of just check in with, whatever their project is. It doesn't matter if it's an article or not, but it's some kind of professional colleague that you can kind of just touch base with and say, how's your big thing that you're working on going? I mean, it could be an exhibition, it could be something else, it could be a database that they're building, it could be a number of things, but how is the big thing? So that you feel like by asking that person how their big thing is going, you're also kind of asking yourself, you're checking in with yourself to see how you're doing on your thing as well. And I would also say a resource for me, I love language and I love words. I absolutely love language. So I listen to podcasts about grammar. I know, kind of creepy, kind of scary. Michelle, you might actually like these. All of you might actually, but they're about grammar, about editing. I just love to learn things like that. And so whenever I'm hearing some of those things, like the proper and improper use of the semicolon, it just really like, it tops me off for the day. It's like, oh, this is exciting. Now I can't wait to see if I'm using it properly. I know that's kind of geeky, but this is what we do. So it's a resource, but it's kind of something that it's not actually helping me to write necessarily better in the moment, but it's contributing to my continual practice. For me, writing is a continual practice. It's something I do almost every day, and I absolutely love it. I'll just put a sidebar in too. We're focusing on articles, and I would say there used to be a paradigm that you had to publish some articles before you published a book, and that is not the case any longer. So let's just say that one of us here has an idea for a book because we have this sort of grand vision of what something might look like. And I wouldn't say that just because you haven't published, you can't publish a book. That's not the case any longer. There is space in publishing, and there is space in publishing books for first-time authors. You really have to know what you're doing, know what you want to say, write a good first chapter, get it to that editor so they can send it out for peer review. And the process is much longer. On average, it's about a year. But please don't think that, you have to do one before you do the other. That is commonly what we do, but that isn't necessarily the case. So I would recommend, there's many publishers. Rowman & Littlefield is the publisher for AAM. And they do an incredible job. I mean, they have this down to a science. They know exactly what they're doing. I've published with them. I've published with Routledge. I published with the University of Kentucky Press. So there's like all these different spaces that people work in. So, please don't feel that you don't have something, that you're not ready yet to publish in that space either. It's similar, but it's also very different. So I'll just kind of stop with that part. And I'll put the link in the chat for Gretchen.
So really the book part, in 2020, our AAM panel on community engagement was cold called by Routledge to create a proposal for publication. And of the panelists that were on our presentation, maybe only one or two of us at the time actually had a publication out of the 5 of us on the panel. And we are actually meeting tomorrow to go over the first draft, because like Julie said, you have to write, a breakdown and an outline of what the book's going to be about. You have to write your first chapter. And the person that is really spearheading this has no publications whatsoever. So it could be as easy as that. If you had a good idea, you sold it well on a national panel, that could turn into a book proposal. We're absolutely shocked that it happened, extremely grateful. And again, that goes back to it, is one of our members is a PhD candidate, no publications. There's me, no masters. There's another woman, no masters. Another woman has a master's. And then the gentleman who's with us, he has no master's and no publications. So we're quite diverse on that.
So Tory, I'm going to be a brat and I'm going to say, we're not going to focus on the degrees we don't have. We're going to focus on the degrees we do have and the experience.
That's right.
So in that grouping, I'm sure there's a ton of experience and obviously some really awesome ideas. So what's the title going to be, or what's the, do you know?
It's going to be a focus on tangible objects at the heart of community engagement. But awesome. It's more so to talk about, again, like I always had that fear that I had to have the master's PhD to publish. Yeah. And a lot of my peers had that same fear too. Because we do talk about it on our museum cafes. We do talk about publishing. It does come up quite often. And that fear is there that, again, I don't have this, I don't have that. And just like Julie said, and it's crazy because it's not until we just had this conversation that it finally clicked again, that you don't have to have these things.
That's
you don't
great.
have to have the publication.
That's
but,
really
yeah,
awesome.
I'm grateful.
Oh, congratulations. That's a big deal. Yay.
Thanks.
Well, speaking of, you don't have to have, a certain degree or something like that. And Tory, I actually think you touched on this a little earlier, but I just want to hear from everybody else too. Do you have to have something new, like a new idea, or a unique perspective on something? Or Julie, I think you mentioned, it could, what if it's just me talking about this project I did with this one university's collection? I'd love to hear from you all about that. And also from those of you who have done reviewing, how many times have you seen the same, or not the same article, but articles about similar things that, they ended up being very different?
So I can jump off on some of that and then go from there. So I think there is kind of an expectation that all articles have something new to say, and you may feel that you don't have the capacity to publish something because you don't have anything to say. But what we try to do, at least with my journal collections, is we try to have a space for the journey and sort of the perspective and the point of view of a particular practitioner or scholar at that moment. And it may not be some earth-shattering revelation that is going to change the space of museums, libraries, and archives work forever. And that's okay, because what we're looking for in our case is about collections and the handling, the care, the conservation, the cataloging, the curation, the interpretation of collections. And so many times case studies are very process oriented, and it might be very specific to an institution, but they can shed so much light on experience in that particular framework that can then translate into other experiences. And that's the beauty of case studies. And think how many times, going back to Tory's comment earlier about being in grad school or being in a space where you've been reading all of these articles, case studies are gold. I mean, they really, really are. And, you know, sometimes people are like, oh no, another case study. It's like, oh, another like day in the life of, but they're fascinating because you're pulling back the curtain on how it really works. And they're incredibly useful, and they're a challenge to write because it's processual writing. So it's very process oriented, and you have to explain it in such a way that someone else who isn't involved in it can understand it. But they also require leaning upon some measure of the literature. I mean, you can't just walk around and say, oh, I did this thing. I mean, you're building upon, knowingly or not, you're building upon the work of others. And so maybe you're kind of thinking through like, oh, when I did X, Y, or Z, I was hearkening back to the way I learned in this particular class. I didn't know it at the moment. And that's okay to then append that citation to a source and say, oh yeah, I was kind of calling upon this theory or that practice. So I think that part. And then the other part too is we have in our journal, we call it notes from the field, and it's very, very short pieces, like 2 or 3 pages. And it's just kind of observations. And so one of them was written by Pam White, who I mentioned earlier, after the Iowa floods in 2011, like all the things she was at University of Iowa Museum of Art, all the things that she learned about collections care, conservation, proper storage, proper out the window, because she was shoving paintings into her little car to get them higher to a higher elevation so they could be carted away to Chicago for safekeeping during the floods. So her piece is about, yeah, I learned all these things and I've been practicing all these things and I'd be telling all my interns all these things, but when push came to shove, I was shoving things in my car. And so those notes from the field pieces are really about kind of really how it works, or kind of observations, or when people are kind of like in this turning point moment of like, oh my goodness, I'm not sure if, those kinds of things. And there's not citations. It's really kind of very personal writing about a moment or an incident or something like that. So.
I really like that. It's kind of like off the cuff writing, if you will. Yeah. And what's real versus what's idealistic, right? Yeah, I like that. Any other kind of comments about, you know, do you need a new perspective to write an article for a journal?
Okay. My cat will chime in first and then I'll follow. I was just going to say that it is one of the things that I did really learn as both as a peer reviewer, but also just kind of helping in various capacities in my museums to do publishing stuff, is that something that maybe doesn't seem earth-shattering to you is still something that's worthy of being explored. And you know, just from my background, when I started at a museum, it was a contemporary art museum at an academic institution in a pretty predominantly rural area. And I was talking to one of our educators who had just published on this, you know, the concept of going into classrooms, like taking the museum into a classroom. And for me, I'd come from a museum where we've been doing that the whole time. And she was like, no, this is like, I got this published because they were really interested in my work. And I was like, that's how publishing works? Like, it blew my mind, because that wasn't, to me as a person who'd seen other folks do it, I was like, well, why would anybody want to write about that? But that story still needs to be told, because I think Julie mentioned this, like there's very specific things about where we were and why it worked and also why it didn't work. And that can be replicated or applied in various forms or fashions in different areas across the country or wherever you're at. And so it really kind of opened my eyes to this idea that like, you don't have to like always have that groundbreaking find. You don't have to only write about the things that are going to completely change the world as everyone knows it. If you find that, that's great. Jump on that as quickly as you can. But that should never invalidate the idea that you do have a unique perspective, and you have if you want to, you have the voice that can explore something that can really kind of impact the way other people think. And I would highly encourage anyone that, even if you're just kind of thinking like, I don't know if this makes sense, try it out, run it past a couple people. And if they think that like, hey, there's something here, then, consider elevating it up past and through those channels and finding a place to put it out into the world.
All wise advice. I think it's really easy for us to underestimate ourselves, right? And for us to think that our voices don't matter, and that they're not going to change anything. But I think it's definitely the opposite most of the time, right? So great advice for sure. And then just trying to be mindful of the time. I think I just have one more question, and then I think we'll open it up for questions from the audience. Since this is supposed to be a session about networking and publishing, and I know we've talked a little bit about networking and how it goes along with publishing, but can you just explain a little bit more in depth, how do networking and publishing go hand in hand?
I'm happy to take it first, but I feel like I've taken some of the questions first. Tori, do you want to go first by chance, or do you want?
I got no problem. So networking and publishing, how does it go hand in hand? Again, going back to networking is crucial to everything you do in this field, whether it's publishing, whether it's curatorial work, whether it's collection management. I can keep going on. It's honestly having platforms like this, having a free open access opportunity where there's participants here who can ask questions and get FaceTime, even though it's virtual, with people such as Julie and Michelle, who are editors of prestigious journals. And it's as simple as messaging Julie after this, or messaging Michelle, hey, I'd like to be a reviewer. Hey, I really enjoyed your presentation. I have this article. Would you mind looking it over? Hey, Tory, how did, I don't know. I don't really know what I can offer, but it's really that simple, as taking advantage of the open access and the free opportunities. Now I understand why networks such as AAM and MAAM and all the other networks have to charge. I get it, but it's hard, especially coming out of a COVID world. 1/3 of museums are apparently closed. Furlough is still a thing. Job loss is still huge. And so I'm extremely grateful when there's platforms like this that people can come in for free and ask questions and be in front of an audience. This is half the battle right here. If you're here right now, or if you view this later, that's fine. You don't have to physically be here. That's the one good thing about multi-access opportunities. It gets you in front of the faces of people who could help. And it's as simple as just reaching out. Again, like I said at the beginning of this presentation, I'm not afraid to go up to someone and say hi, but it is easier on screen. It's easier for me to send an email. And if you don't respond, that's fine. I'll be a little sad afterwards, but it's easier than being rejected in a face-to-face. So use this as an opportunity. Use it as an opportunity to network. If you have something you want to publish, here's two wonderful people who will look things over and give you excellent advice on how to actually move forward, level up, and demystify that process. And if they can't help you, they're going to get someone for you who can. And you really can't put a price tag on that. And that is one thing that does make me grateful about this field, is how willing people are to help you better yourself, because at the end of the day, we want a better museum for the future, and that starts with the publishing.
Michelle, did you want to go, or did you want me to go next?
Go ahead.
Okay. Okay. I would say the connection, a connection between networking and publishing. I was thinking when Tory was speaking that AAM, has the professional network. So American Alliance of Museums has all the different professional networks. And so I am in Museum Studies Network, which is bridging together the theory and practice of museum studies. So a number of us are museum studies faculty members, a number are graduate students and emerging professionals, a number are people working in space museums and kind of in that allied space. And in our immediate group, there isn't a specific publishing venue, but so it's called a network, but it's called a network for different reasons. And so what I find though in that group is a lot of people who have similar interests, and you can kind of point me in a direction, or I point them in a direction for something similar, or people will ask me a question. So that's one kind of network, like a fully constructed network that exists, and you kind of opt in, you kind of go there and do your thing. And NEMPN is another type or another model for a network that is outside of AAM. And so there's this other constituency, this convening. And I think both of those models are incredibly useful. And I think part of the journey of making your way in the space of museums, or if you're in archives or a cognate field, is trying to find what your network actually is, whether that is the group of people. So I identify really strongly with public history because I'm out doing walking tours and all sorts of things out in the space, and making history relevant in day-to-day life for people, or doing oral histories to kind of figure out the sort of story beneath the story. And so part of my network might very well be community conveners in Rochester, New York, where I live now, thought leaders and elders of communities that are not credentialed by AAM and are not credentialed by a graduate degree in some particular lens, but they're part of my network, and together we build and construct the thing that we're doing, whatever the thing actually is. And so like trying to figure out who is in your space, and if you want to publish something, then where does that sort of Gantt chart overlap? So this is my community that I'm working with in a project or in a space, and this is my community of people who are publishing, and they might very well be an overlap. And so I think having a fluidity about the network, whatever your networks are, is really important, because those change. A lot of the individuals that I'm working with now, I wasn't working with obviously before I moved to Rochester, but even before that. And so trying to figure out who your community is, and it's really communities, and how can you work in a space of publishing and work with your communities to publish, particularly source communities. And I think that's really important. And so it can happen at conferences, but it might very well happen in your community in another way. And I second what Tory said about the virtual space with Zoom and all of these other events that people are able to have and to host. And thanks to NEMPM for hosting us tonight, you know, that's given people opportunities to convene. And I use that word intentionally, to convene and to have a conversation, and to think about these things in a way that helps us also to continue to reflect while we're doing it, as opposed to just, I'm going through the motion and then I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. It's like we're also thinking about the process of it too. So I know that was a lot, and it was kind of a brain dump, but I'd send it back for peer review if it was an article.
Michelle, did you want to add anything?
I think the only thing that I would add, because I mean, both Tory and Julie really got, I think, the crux of it all, but I would say too that as you find folks who are helping you, to just hold on to that, you know, and nurture those relationships as well. I've worked with a number of authors for different projects that are like, they will only go to one editor because that is the person that understands them, or that is the person who, like, their feedback is the best. Like, once you find that, like, find a way to keep it going and nurture it, because that also just helps you grow and continue to, like, expand your impact as a writer, as an author. So I would say that in addition to sort of reaching out, you know, as Tory mentioned, and to Julie's point, like expanding what you consider to be a network, it's also just really nurturing those things and understanding that, like, those people are there to support and help, and whether that's because you've asked them because they're a dear friend, or you've paid them because that's their job. Like, either way, it works out really well. And when you can find that and when you click, it can be so beneficial. And so the sort of inverse is also true. If for some reason you work with an editor that's just like not working out, that does not have to be the end of the road. And it does not have to be like the end of you writing or publishing or anything like that. It just means you need to go find somebody else. And so keeping that idea open too, that like those things will shift and those expectations will change, and that that's also okay. It's kind of growing and evolving.
Yeah, all good advice. And, you know, again, with the networking, you know, Tory mentioned this, Julie mentioned this, Michelle mentioned this, you know, there are discussion boards out there, including, you know, NEMPNs that's on the Mighty Network. I feel like our community is very supportive. Before I joined the board, I mean, that's why I became interested in the board, was because I could ask any question. And people were just so nice and were like, let me send you my syllabus. Let me, you know, I'll mail this book to you. Send me a private message and I'd be happy to chat with you, you know, like use your community, you know, because that's what they're there for. And I think we all got into this field because we are naturally altruistic people, and so we want to help. You know, and so you know, I hesitate to say take advantage of that, but take advantage of that, you know, like use the people who are here for you and want to be here for you. So yeah, all good advice. And as you all, you know, hinted at, networking and publishing are like this, you need one in order to do the other. So thank you. And I just kind of want to open it up to questions. You can either type your question in the chat or feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question that way too.
While we're waiting on any questions, let me just say, go back to what Tory said, the cold call email. Go ahead and do it. Like people cold call email me all the time. And like Tory says, you know, you can hide behind the screen, and people are so intimidated. Like, I don't want to email someone. People cold call email me probably, I'm not kidding, once a day. And it doesn't bother me at all. And sometimes I have no idea what the answer is. And it's not always about publishing. It could be about something else. And I just tell them, I have no clue, but here's who you might go to. And it might bounce it down the road to somebody else. But we needed a reviewer for a journal article on isotopic chemistry in heritage collections. And we have one person who can do that, but that's it. And this person can't do it because they're too close to this collection. So I cold emailed somebody from a completely different university and said, do you have a reviewer that you might recommend? He said, yeah, I've got two. And it's like literally a cold call email. This person does not know me. And he said, yep, here's two people. And I was like, boom, that's what I needed. So I do it too. So people cold email me and I cold email other people.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no shame in doing that. It's how we get things done. So
yeah, and I always feel like the worst thing that can happen is they just don't respond, or generally that's the worst thing that can happen, right? And so it's like, what are you gonna lose? Like nothing. So. And also, you know, I don't want to put anyone on the spot. So, you know, if you'd rather ask your question over email, I'm sure our presenters would be happy to drop their emails in the chat for you. That way, networking, you can cold email them and ask your questions that way too. And I can also drop my email in the chat in case you have follow-up questions for the presenters or just in general about the Skillshare. I'm happy to help in any way that I can too. Mine's kind of long, I'm sorry. Heather is asking, what are some of the podcasts? Julie, you had mentioned podcasts earlier.
So the editing podcast, it's so dreamy. It's Louise Hornby, and I forget the other one, Denise something. One is, they're British, one is a fiction editor, one is a nonfiction editor. So it's called The Editing Podcast, and they haven't done a new series yet for right now. It's from 2020, I think is the latest ones, but so they had like a whole episode on the semicolon. It was really great. And then there's another one called Pixel, and this one's a little bit, I think it's PIXL, but that's a little bit different. It's about leadership and books and education. but they do actually talk about publishing too. And so that one's kind of hit or miss, because sometimes the topic is like so fascinating to me, and other times I'm like, oh, please, like I'll just wait until the next one. But they, both of them have good backlog archives that you can kind of go through. And those are two of my favorites. And then I did put the Gretchen Rubin quiz in there. So Gretchen Rubin has a podcast called Happier, which I don't like the name. It just sounds a little lame, but it's actually about the Four Tendencies and some other things too. And so I love that one too. That one's more about kind of outer order, inner calm, right? So how can you structure your life so that you have this sense of calm, so you can kind of plow through and get your work done or whatever. So those are the three that I recommend. I'll find links and put them in the chat.
Thanks, Julie. I might definitely check out those grammar podcasts, because yeah, that's kind of my thing. And I don't usually like podcasts, but maybe if it's about grammar, I will. Like, maybe I just haven't found the right podcast. So I'm definitely going to check those out personally. Do we have any other questions? If not, totally okay. I'm not going to pressure anybody. Julie just dropped that link there into the chat too. And then, I know throughout the discussion, folks were dropping links in the chat. So just make sure that you get those before we end. And if you don't and you want the links later on, just email me. I get the transcripts from the chat box, so I can send those to you later on too. All right, well, if there aren't any more questions, I think we'll just conclude tonight. And I just want to thank everybody for joining us. I know it's super close to a holiday weekend. So thank you so much for taking the time tonight to be with us. And thank you so much to our incredible panelists as well for taking the time out of your schedules. I really hope that this was helpful for people and that this gave you some insight into the publishing world. So thanks everybody, and have a good night, all right?
Thank you all so much. It was great to have everyone here. Thank you. Good to see my friends. Bye.
Bye everybody.